September 19th, 1948, 8:47 p.m. Wells Restaurant, 135th Street in Harlem. The temperature had dropped to 60 degrees after an afternoon of rain. Wet pavement reflected the neon lights like shattered mirrors. Inside the restaurant, 40 people were having dinner, unaware they were about to witness a moment that would redefine the future of organized crime in New York. Cigarette smoke from Lucky Strikes and Pall Malls hung in the air like battlefield fog. Dizzy Gillespie's Manteca played on the jukebox, that jazz piece that made even the calmest person feel electricity in their veins. The smell of fried chicken, pork ribs, and collard greens mixed with the aroma of bourbon whiskey flowing generously that night. At that exact moment, 8:47 p.m., 6 men crossed through the door. They didn't enter, they invaded. $3,000 Italian suits, polished leather shoes stepping on the linoleum floor like they were conquering enemy territory. The bulges under their jackets were so obvious they didn't even try to hide them. 6 guns. 6 men with a suicide mission: to insult the most dangerous man in New York in his own sanctuary. What happened in the next 10 minutes wouldn't just change the rules of organized crime in America. It would change the way the Italian Mafia understood power. Because when Sal Bonanno, the butcher of Brooklyn, called Bumpy Johnson the most offensive racial slur that exists, he expected immediate violence. He expected Bumpy to pull out his legendary straight razor. He expected blood on the floor, screaming, chaos. He expected the perfect justification for a war his Uncle Joe had been wanting to start for years. What he got was something infinitely worse. 6 words spoken with a calm that chilled you to the bone. 6 words that would haunt him to his grave 4 years later. Because Bumpy Johnson wasn't an ordinary criminal who settled insults with violence. He was a grandmaster of human chess. And he'd already planned the next 20 moves before Sal even walked through that door. To understand why those 6 words terrified a professional killer more than any death threat, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson really was. And no, he wasn't just a Harlem gangster. He wasn't some street thug who climbed the ladder through pure violence. Bumpy Johnson was the architect of an empire that the Italian Mafia, with all their resources, political connections, and decades of experience, had been trying to conquer for years without success. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born October 31st, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina, Jim Crow South, where black men lived under a system designed to keep them on their knees. His family moved to Harlem in 1919 when he was 14, escaping the racial violence of the South, but arriving in a North that had its own forms of oppression. Harlem in those years was a cauldron of contradictions. The Harlem Renaissance flourished in jazz clubs. Langston Hughes wrote poetry. Duke Ellington played at the Cotton Club. But behind that cultural facade, poverty devoured entire families. Jobs were scarce, apartments were overcrowded, and street gang violence was law. A bump on the back of his skull, the result of a childhood fall, gave him the nickname Bumpy. But it was his hands that gave him his true reputation. They weren't large hands or particularly imposing. They were an artist's hands, precise, patient, lethal. Bumpy didn't fight like common thugs who settled disputes with fists in dark alleys. Bumpy fought like a chess master who had already visualized the next 3 moves, while his opponent was still deciding the first. His favorite weapon wasn't a .45 caliber pistol like the ones Italian gangsters carried. It was a straight razor he'd bought at a barbershop on 125th Street when he was 16. A razor with a mother-of-pearl handle that fit perfectly in his vest pocket. That razor had carved his legend into the flesh of more than 30 men who made the fatal mistake of underestimating the skinny kid from South Carolina. He didn't kill for pleasure. he killed with purpose. And every scar he left was a lesson that Harlem's underworld learned quickly. Never mistake Bumpy's calm for weakness. But here's the secret the Italian Mafia never understood. Bumpy Johnson's real weapon wasn't made of steel. It wasn't forged in iron or loaded with bullets. His most powerful weapon was something intangible, something that couldn't be bought with money or taken by force. It was the absolute, unshakable loyalty of an entire community. While the Italian Mafia ruled Manhattan with fear, extortion, and bloodshed, Bumpy Johnson ruled Harlem with something revolutionary. Respect earned inch by inch over 2 decades of protecting his people. You see, in the 30s, while America bled through the Great Depression, Harlem suffered a crisis within the crisis. Black men couldn't get work even in the worst jobs. Families were evicted weekly. Children died of pneumonia because their parents couldn't afford a doctor. In that desperate context, the numbers racket flourished. The numbers were the underground lottery of black folks. You bet pennies on 3-digit combinations. If your number hit, you won. For the people of Harlem, this wasn't just gambling. It was hope. That 10-cent bet was the difference between buying your kid shoes or watching him walk barefoot in winter. Whoever controlled the numbers controlled Harlem. Millions of dollars flowing every year. Stephanie St. Clair, Madam Queen, had built that empire in the 20s. Brilliant, ruthless when she needed to be, absolutely loyal to her community. But when Dutch Schultz decided he wanted Harlem for himself, he nearly destroyed her. In 1932, Stephanie sought out the only man in Harlem who combined strategic intelligence with brutal execution capability. Bumpy Johnson, barely 27, already had a reputation as the man you didn't cross. The meeting was in an apartment on 102nd Street. Stephanie, dressed in impeccable elegance despite fleeing from Dutch Schultz's hitmen, made him a proposal that would change Harlem's fate. Protect my numbers operation. Keep it out of Italian and Irish hands. In return, I'll make you the most powerful man north of 110th Street. Bumpy accepted. Not out of unbridled ambition, out of principle. Because he saw what Stephanie saw. The numbers weren't just a business. They were the only form of economic self-determination the black community had in a city that treated them like second-class citizens. If the mob took control of the numbers, Harlem would lose more than money. It would lose its dignity. The war that followed was brutal. Dutch Schultz sent his best assassins. Bumpy eliminated them one by one. Not in spectacular shootouts that would draw police attention, in dark alleys, in stairwells of abandoned buildings, with that straight razor that became urban legend. They said Bumpy could cut a throat so fast and clean, the victim didn't realize they were dying until they tried to speak, and only blood came out. By 1935, after Dutch Schultz was killed in Newark, Bumpy controlled the entire operation. And here's what was extraordinary, what separated him from any other criminal of his era. Bumpy didn't use that power to enrich himself at his community's expense. He used it to build what New York City never built for the people of Harlem: social infrastructure. When a neighborhood kid needed money for school, Bumpy paid. When a family was about to be evicted, Bumpy showed up with the rent. When corrupt police tried to shake down a black merchant, Bumpy made sure those officers got a painful reminder about respect. He didn't do it for public relations. He did it because he genuinely believed Harlem deserved protection, and if the law wouldn't provide it, he would. By 1948, 16 years after taking control of the numbers, Bumpy Johnson was more than a criminal. He was an institution. Millions of dollars flowed through his hands every year. Money he reinvested in Harlem in ways no white politician ever would. He financed businesses, paid for funerals, protected his people from criminal and police violence alike. And the Italian Mafia watched all this with a mixture of admiration and impotent fury. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, the man who really controlled New York from the shadows, tried to negotiate multiple times. He sent intermediaries with increasingly generous offers: 20% of the profits, 30%, 40%. Bumpy rejected each one with the same polite but unwavering response: "Harlem's not for sale." Vito Genovese, more violent and less diplomatic than Costello, decided words weren't working. He sent threats, mutilated corpses left on corners as warnings. He burned down 2 bars that worked with Bumpy, but he discovered something that deeply disturbed him. He couldn't scare a man who'd grown up in Jim Crow South, where death was an everyday possibility. And he couldn't terrorize a community that saw Bumpy not as a criminal, but as their protector. So Joe Bonanno, one of the 5 most powerful bosses in New York, decided the time had come for direct action. If neither negotiations nor threats worked, they had to send a message impossible to ignore. And for that, he sent his nephew, Salvatore Bonanno, called Sal the Butcher. And that nickname wasn't criminal marketing or exaggeration. It was a literal description of his method of work. In 1946, a guy named Mickey Rosenberg tried to steal $15,000 from a Bonanno poker game in Brooklyn. Mickey thought he was smart, thought he could disappear into the streets of New York and nobody would find him. It took Sal 3 days to locate him. What Sal did next became urban legend whispered in speakeasies and Italian social clubs. They found pieces of Mickey Rosenberg in 4 different boroughs: a hand in the East River, a foot in a Queens alley, and the head, carefully wrapped in newspaper, left on his mother's doorstep in the Bronx. Sal Bonanno stood 6'2", 230 pounds of muscle built hauling fish crates on the Brooklyn docks since he was 14. His hands looked like sledgehammers. His neck had the thickness of a human thigh. He wore custom-made suits from Naples that cost $3,000 each. But no suit could disguise what he really was: an instrument of human destruction with Italian manners. He'd killed 17 men that police knew about, probably double that unreported. And every murder was a piece of theater designed to send a message. Nobody stole from the Bonannos. Nobody defied the Bonannos. And nobody, absolutely nobody, refused when the Bonannos asked for something. His job the night of September 19, 1948 was straightforward: force Bumpy Johnson to hand over control of the numbers or turn him into an example so bloody the rest of Harlem would kneel in fear. Joe Bonanno had been clear in his instructions: use words first. But if that Negro doesn't understand reason, do what you do best. Just make sure when you're done, Harlem understands who runs New York. That night, Sal walked through the door of Wells' restaurant with the confidence of a conqueror stepping onto defeated territory. 6 men behind him, all veterans of territorial wars. Tony the Fat Maranzano, who'd survived the Castellamarese War of the 30s. Frankie 3 Fingers, called that for obvious reasons, but still the best shooter in the family. Johnny Nose, who could smell betrayals before they happened. And 3 more, soldiers without fancy nicknames, but with violence records that spoke for themselves. The bulges under their jackets were so obvious they didn't even try to hide them. 6 bulges that anyone with half a brain recognized as guns. That was precisely the message. We're not here to negotiate like civilized businessmen. We're here with power. We're here to take what's ours by right. Wells' restaurant wouldn't impress anyone looking for luxury. No crystal chandeliers or starched white tablecloths like the Little Italy restaurants where the mob held their summits. It was a modest place, Red leather booths worn by years of use, red and white checkered tablecloths, scuffed linoleum floor, black and white photos on the walls showing Harlem in its Renaissance heyday. Duke Ellington, Langston Hughes, Josephine Baker. The aroma was a symphony of Southern soul food. Fried chicken, pork ribs, collard greens with bacon, mac and cheese, and that smell of bourbon whiskey spilled on the bar, mixing with the thick smoke of Lucky Strike cigarettes floating near the ceiling like storm clouds. The Wurlitzer jukebox, with its flickering neon tubes, played the best of jazz. That night, Dizzy Gillespie, Manteca, that revolutionary Afro-Cuban piece that made even the most stoic tap their foot to the rhythm. The conversations that night were plentiful. 40 people filled the place. Couples celebrating anniversaries, jazz musicians who'd finished their sets at the clubs on 125th Street, numbers runners who worked for Bumpy, preachers drinking whiskey, even two Irish cops more loyal to Bumpy than to their captain, because Bumpy paid better than the New York Police Department. But that place was more than a restaurant. It was Bumpy Johnson's throne. Sacred neutral ground where musicians, preachers, black politicians, corrupt cops, criminals, and common folks could eat without fear. You could have beef on the streets. You could owe money. Nothing mattered within those four walls. Bumpy's peace was absolute law, and breaking that peace was summoning a death sentence. When Sal crossed that door, conversations died mid-sentence. Forks froze in mid-air. Even the music on the jukebox seemed to lower in volume, as if the machine itself knew something terrible was about to happen. Bumpy sat in his usual corner booth, the one with a perfect view of both doors and the kitchen. He never sat with his back to anything. His wife, Mamie, sat across from him. Elegant, serene, with the kind of presence that could silence an entire room without saying a word. Bumpy was eating a medium-rare ribeye, cutting it with the same methodical precision he did everything. Calculated movements. No rush. No waste. Sal walked straight to the table. Didn't ask permission. Didn't wait for an invitation. Just planted himself in front of Bumpy like he was standing before a subordinate. His 6 men dispersed strategically throughout the restaurant. Combat positions, exits blocked. "Bumpy Johnson, we need to talk," Sal said. His voice loud enough for everyone to hear. That was the point. Public humiliation. Bumpy didn't look up, kept cutting his steak. The sound of the knife against the porcelain was the only noise in the absolute silence of the restaurant. "I'm eating," Bumpy responded. His voice so calm it was frightening. Sal smiled, not a friendly smile, a predator's smile that had already tasted blood. "Yeah, I can see you're eating. Nice place, real quaint. But here's the situation, Bumpy. My Uncle Joe's got a problem. He thinks it's time Harlem understood how things work. The numbers business, that's Italian territory now. Always should have been." Bumpy put his fork on the table, wiped the corners of his mouth with his napkin. Then, for the first time, he looked up at Sal. His eyes showed no anger. They showed something worse. Absolute calm that froze the blood. "Here's the offer," Sal continued, interpreting that calm as weakness. "You hand over the operation. We give you 10% for your trouble. You can keep your restaurant, play the big man in front of your people. But the real money, that stays where it belongs, with us." The entire restaurant held its breath. 40 people turned to stone. Mamie looked at Sal with the kind of contempt that could freeze hell. Bumpy folded his napkin with the same precision he used to cut his meat, placed it on the table. "That's a generous offer," Bumpy said in a voice so even it was terrifying. "But I'm going to have to decline." Sal's smile disappeared. "You're making a mistake. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. This isn't one of them." And then Sal said it. The word. The slur. The line that should never have been crossed. Listen, N-word. Mamie's fork hit her plate. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The entire restaurant sank into a silence so thick you could hear the wall clock ticking. The kind of silence where people decide if they'll see sunrise. Bumpy's expression didn't change. Showed no anger, showed no surprise. But everyone in that restaurant who knew Bumpy Johnson, everyone who understood what he was capable of, felt their blood turn to ice. Because Bumpy Johnson sitting perfectly still was more dangerous than most men in motion. His right hand moved slowly toward his vest. Sal's 6 bodyguards tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. But Bumpy didn't pull a gun. He pulled out his razor. The same straight razor he'd carried since he was 16. The one he'd used to build his reputation by carving it into the flesh of men who'd underestimated him. He placed it on the table gently, next to his steak knife. "You brought 6 men," Bumpy said quietly, his voice so calm it was terrifying. "6 guns into my restaurant and you think that makes you dangerous." Sal tried to laugh it off. "I think it makes me smart." "No," Bumpy said. "It makes you ignorant." He stood up slowly. Sal's 6 bodyguards reached for their weapons halfway. Bumpy didn't even glance at them. "You see these people?" Bumpy said, gesturing to the 40 people in the restaurant. "You think they're just customers? Just innocent folks eating dinner?" Sal looked around. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his eyes. "Let me educate you, Sal. That man by the door, his name's Thomas. I paid his daughter's hospital bills when she had pneumonia. That woman in the red dress, her husband used to beat her. I made sure he stopped. That kid washing dishes in the back. I kept him out of jail when the cops tried to frame him for something he didn't do." Bumpy took a step closer. Sal's bodyguards raised their weapons halfway. But Bumpy didn't stop. "Every person in this restaurant owes me something, not because I demanded it, because I earned it. You brought 6 guns into my house, Sal, but I've got 40 soldiers. They're just not wearing suits." Sal swallowed hard, glanced around the room again. The faces staring back at him weren't afraid. They were waiting for Bumpy's signal. "Now," Bumpy said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I'm going to give you a choice. You can apologize to my wife for using that word in her presence. Then you can walk out of here and tell your Uncle Joe that Harlem's not for sale." Or he picked up the razor, opened it slowly. The blade caught the light. "You can find out why they call this Bumpy's Kingdom." Sal Bonanno had killed 17 men in his career. He'd broken bones, burned businesses, extorted millions. He wasn't used to being afraid. But standing there in that restaurant, surrounded by 40 silent witnesses, staring into Bumpy Johnson's cold, calm eyes, Sal felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child. Terror. Not the terror of physical pain. The terror of realizing you've miscalculated badly and there's no way out. Bumpy smiled. That same smile from before. The one that said he already knew how this story ended. Then Bumpy Johnson said 6 words. 6 words that would echo through the criminal underworld for decades. "Your uncle will bury you tomorrow." The words hung in the air like poison smoke. Sal's face went pale. "What?" "You heard me," Bumpy said calmly. "You walked into my restaurant, disrespected me, disrespected my wife, disrespected my people, and you think you're walking out of here?" Sal's 6 bodyguards raised their guns fully, all 6 pistols pointing directly at Bumpy. He didn't even blink. "You can shoot me," Bumpy said, "and maybe you'll kill me. But the moment you pull those triggers, 40 people in this room will tear you apart. And even if you make it out, even if you somehow fight your way to that door, you think you're making it out of Harlem alive? This is my city, Sal. Every block, every corner, every alley. You're already dead. You just don't know it yet. The silence was absolute. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, someone's shallow, rapid breathing. Sal's hand was shaking. Barely noticeable, but it was shaking. Then Bumpy gave him the mercy he didn't deserve. Or, Bumpy said softly, "You can apologize to my wife, walk out of here, and never come back. Tell your uncle if he wants Harlem, he can come himself. But he better bring more than 6 men." For 10 seconds, nobody moved. 10 seconds that felt like 10 years. Then Sal Bonanno lowered his weapon. His crew looked at him in shock, but Sal wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Mamie. "Mrs. Johnson," Sal said, his voice barely audible. I apologize. That word, I shouldn't have said it." Mamie didn't respond, just stared at him with those cold, unforgiving eyes. Sal backed away slowly. His crew followed him, weapons still out but lowered. They moved toward the door like men walking away from a bomb they'd accidentally triggered. When Sal reached the door, he turned back one last time. "This isn't over, Bumpy." Bumpy sat back down, picked up his fork, cut another piece of steak. "Yes, it is," Bumpy said without looking up. "You just don't know it yet." Sal and his crew left. The door swung shut behind them. For a moment, the restaurant stayed silent. Then someone started clapping. Slow at first, then faster. Then everyone was clapping, standing, cheering. Bumpy Johnson had just stared down 6 armed mobsters without firing a single shot. Mamie reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," Bumpy replied. "Respect is everything. You lose that, you lose everything." Sal Bonanno left Harlem that night. He never came back. 3 days later, the 5 families held an emergency meeting in Manhattan. Joe Bonanno wanted revenge. He wanted Harlem. He wanted Bumpy Johnson dead. But Frank Costello, the man who really ran New York's underworld, said something that changed everything. Bumpy Johnson runs Harlem because Harlem wants him to. We try to take it by force. We start a war we can't win. Not because we can't kill him, but because we can't kill the 40,000 people who die for him. Leave Harlem alone. And they did. From that night forward, the Italian mob never tried to take over Harlem's numbers racket again. They made deals. They negotiated. They showed respect. Because Bumpy Johnson taught them something they'd forgotten. Power isn't just about guns and money. It's about loyalty. It's about earning the respect of people who don't have to give it to you. Sal Bonanno died in 1952, heart attack. Some people said it was natural. Others said Bumpy had a long memory. Nobody knows for sure. But here's what we do know. After that night in September 1948, nobody ever disrespected Bumpy Johnson in his own restaurant again. And that razor he put on the table, he never had to use it again. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon a man has isn't made of steel. It's the love of his people.